Welcome back, everyone. Before we begin, make sure to like and subscribe, and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. Story 1. The Red-Eyed Man. My name's Dale Morrison, and I've been hauling freight across Texas for the better part of 23 years. I've seen my share of strange things on these desert highways. Mirages that look like lakes, dust devils that dance like ghosts, and wildlife that moves in ways that don't make sense. But what happened to me near Fort Stockton on a Tuesday night in October changed everything I thought I knew about what's possible on these lonesome roads. It was around 2 a.m. and I was running behind schedule. I'd picked up a load of electronics in El Paso and needed to get them to Houston by Thursday morning. The customer was paying good money for expedited delivery, so I was pushing hard through the night, running on coffee and determination. Highway 285 stretched out ahead of me like a black ribbon, lit only by my headlights cutting through the darkness. The desert on both sides was absolute. No lights, no signs of civilization, just endless scrubland disappearing into the void. I had my CB tuned to channel 19, listening to the occasional chatter from other drivers, but mostly it was just static. The radio was playing some late-night talk show out of San Antonio, the host's voice a comforting drone in the background. My rig was running smooth, the engine humming its familiar rhythm, and despite being tired, I felt good. Alert, ready to eat up the miles. That's when I saw him. At first, it was just a shape on the shoulder of the road, maybe a quarter-mile ahead. In the darkness, it looked like someone walking. Not unusual, really. Sometimes you'd see hitchhikers out here, though Lord knows why anyone would try to thumb a ride in the middle of nowhere at 2 a.m. As I got closer, I could make out more details. It was a man, tall and thin, wearing what looked like a dark coat or jacket. He was walking with purpose, not stumbling like someone who'd been drinking or was injured. I started to slow down, thinking maybe I should stop and see if he needed help. The nearest town was Fort Stockton, still about 30 miles east, and it would be a hell of a walk in the desert heat come morning. But something made me hesitate. Something about the way he moved, maybe, or just the wrongness of finding someone out there in the middle of absolute nowhere. As my headlights swept over him, I got a better look. He was wearing a long, dark coat that seemed to absorb the light rather than reflect it. His hair was black and seemed to move in a wind I couldn't feel. But it was when he turned his head toward my approaching truck that my blood turned to ice water in my veins. His eyes glowed red. Not reflected red like you might see from an animal caught in headlights, but glowing red like two taillights burning in his skull. The light was intense, almost blinding, and it seemed to pulse with its own internal fire. I blinked hard, thinking maybe I was seeing things, that I was more tired than I thought, or that it was some trick of my headlights in the darkness. But when I looked again, those red eyes were still there, fixed on me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. I pressed harder on the accelerator, wanting to get past this guy as quickly as possible. Something about him scared me on a level I couldn't explain. It was like every instinct I'd developed in over 2 decades of driving was screaming at me to get away from him, to put as much distance between us as possible. The speedometer climbed from 65 to 75 as I passed him. That's when he turned to watch me go by. His head swiveled to follow my truck, those red eyes tracking my movement with predatory focus. I could feel his gaze like a physical weight pressing against the side of my cab. The hair on my arm stood up, and I had to fight the urge to floor it and run. Instead, I maintained my speed and tried to focus on the road ahead, telling myself it was just some weird guy with maybe reflective contacts or something. There had to be a logical explanation, but then I made the mistake of checking my rearview mirror. The man was running behind my truck, not jogging, not fast walking, but running at full sprint. and he was keeping up. I was doing 75 miles per hour, and this guy was matching my speed on foot, his red eyes burning in my mirror like demonic headlights. His coat was streaming behind him like wings, and his legs were pumping in a rhythm that seemed too fast, too fluid, too inhuman. I stamped on the accelerator, pushing my rig up to 80, then 85. The engine roared and the trailer swayed slightly behind me, but I didn't care. I had to get away from whatever was chasing me. I glanced in the mirror again, praying he'd fallen behind, but he was still there, still running, those red eyes boring into me through the darkness. My heart was hammering so hard I thought it might burst. Sweat was pouring down my face despite the air conditioning. I grabbed the CB mic with a shaking hand and keyed it up. Breaker 19, Breaker 19, this is Big Dale eastbound on 285 near Fort Stockton. I got a situation here, anybody copy? Static answered me. I tried again, my voice cracking with fear. Any drivers out there, please respond. I got some kind of emergency here. Nothing. The CB was dead, not even the usual background chatter. It was like every other truck had vanished from the highway, leaving me alone with whatever was chasing me. I looked in the mirror one more time, and suddenly he was gone. The road behind me was empty, lit by my taillights but showing nothing else. I eased off the accelerator, bringing my speed back down to a more reasonable 70, my hands trembling on the steering wheel. Maybe I'd imagined the whole thing. Maybe I was more exhausted than I thought. Maybe it had been some kind of hallucination brought on by too much caffeine and not enough sleep. But then I noticed the smell. It was sulfur. Sharp and acrid like rotten eggs mixed with burning rubber. It filled my cab, making me gag and roll down the windows to try to clear the air. The desert wind rushed in hot and dry, but it carried that awful smell even stronger. I pulled over at the next rest area, a small truck stop with a couple of diesel pumps and a convenience store that was closed for the night. I climbed out of my cab on shaking legs and walked around my truck, checking for damage, looking for anything that might explain what I'd experienced. The tires were fine, no signs of overheating. The trailer was secure, the doors still locked and sealed. Everything looked normal. But when I got back in the cab, I found something that made my blood run cold all over again. On my passenger seat there was a single black feather. It was huge, easily 8 inches long, and it seemed to absorb light like that man's coat had. When I picked it up, it was warm to the touch and left a faint residue on my fingers that smelled like sulfur. I threw it out the window and got back on the road, driving straight through to Houston without stopping again. I didn't sleep for 2 days after that, and when I finally did, I had nightmares about red eyes and the sound of running footsteps on asphalt. I never drove Highway 285 at night again, and I never told anyone what happened until now. But sometimes on other desert highways, when I'm driving alone in the dark, I catch a glimpse of red light in my mirrors. And I know he's still out there running through the Texas night, waiting for another trucker foolish enough to slow down when they see a man walking on the shoulder of the road. And I want you to know that I've always been a skeptical man. 28 years of over-the-road trucking will do that to you. You hear all kinds of stories from other drivers, ghost trucks, phantom hitchhikers, weird lights in the sky, and you learn to take most of it with a grain of salt. Drivers spend a lot of time alone, and sometimes the mind plays tricks on you. That's what I always told myself anyway, until I spent a night at mile marker 187 on Highway 90, about 40 miles east of Marfa. Every trucker who runs the Texas routes knows about mile marker 187. It's become something of a legend in truck stops and driver lounges across the state. The stories are always the same: strange sounds at night, shadows that move when there's nothing to cast them, and a feeling of being watched that never goes away. Most drivers just give it a wide berth, finding somewhere else to park when they need rest. But like I said, I was skeptical. I figured it was just superstition, the kind of thing that spreads through the trucking community like wildfire because we all love a good scary story. I was running a load of agricultural equipment from Phoenix to New Orleans, taking the southern route through Texas to avoid some construction delays up north. It had been a long day and I was pushing up against my hours of service limits. The law says a driver can only work 14 hours in a day, and I was coming up on that deadline fast. I needed to find a place to park for my mandatory 10-hour rest period, and mile marker 187 offered a wide shoulder and relatively level ground, perfect for a safe overnight stop. It was about 9 p.m. when I pulled over, the sun having set an hour earlier and the desert already cooling down from the day's heat. The spot looked ideal. Plenty of room to park without blocking traffic, good visibility in both directions, and far enough from the road that I wouldn't be disturbed by passing vehicles. I set my brakes, shut down the engine, and went through my usual pre-sleep routine. I checked the trailer doors, made sure my load was secure, and did a quick walk-around inspection of the truck. Everything seemed normal. The desert was quiet except for the distant sound of wind through the scrub brush and the occasional car passing on the highway. I could see the lights of Marfa twinkling in the distance, a small but comforting reminder of civilization in the vast emptiness around me. Back in my sleeper berth, I made a quick sandwich from supplies I kept in my cooler, caught up on some paperwork, and settled in for the night. I've always been a good sleeper on the road. Years of practice have taught me how to ignore the sounds of traffic and settle into rest wherever I park. But that night was different. I kept waking up every hour or so, feeling restless and uneasy without knowing why. Each time I'd check my watch, look out the windows to make sure everything was secure, and try to go back to sleep. But the feeling of unease kept growing stronger. Around 2 a.m., I was awakened by a sound I'd never heard before in all my years of trucking. It was a rhythmic thumping, like someone knocking on the side of my truck. Not unusual in itself. Sometimes other drivers will knock to ask for help with directions or mechanical problems. But this knocking was different. It was too soft, too hesitant, and it seemed to be coming from multiple directions at once. I lay in my bunk listening, trying to locate the source of the sound. Thump, thump, thump on the driver's side, then thump, thump, thump on the passenger side, then from behind on the trailer doors. It was like someone or several someones were walking around my truck, randomly knocking on different surfaces. But when I looked out the windows, I couldn't see anyone. The knocking continued for about 10 minutes, moving around the truck in what seemed like a slow circle. Sometimes it would stop for a minute or two and I'd think it was over, but then it would start again from a different location. I grabbed my flashlight and was about to get out to investigate when the sound stopped completely. The desert was silent again. No wind, no traffic, nothing. I waited another few minutes, then cracked, opened the driver's side door, and stepped out onto the running board, sweeping my flashlight around the area. Nothing. No footprints in the sand, no signs that anyone had been near my truck. Just my rig sitting alone on the shoulder under a canopy of stars so bright they seemed close enough to touch. I was starting to think I'd dreamed the whole thing when I noticed something that made my skin crawl. The dirt and sand around my truck were covered with footprints. Not boot prints or shoe prints, but small, bare footprints like those a child might make. They circled my truck completely, dozens of them, overlapping and crisscrossing in patterns that didn't make sense. Some were so small they might have been made by a toddler, while others were slightly larger, maybe from children 8 or 10 years old. But the really disturbing thing was that the prints seemed to lead away from my truck in all directions, disappearing into the desert darkness. It was as if a group of children had surrounded my truck, walked around it multiple times, and then scattered into the night. But what would children be doing out here, 40 miles from the nearest town in the middle of the desert at 2 a.m.? I stood there for a long time, shining my flashlight on those prints, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Part of me wanted to follow one of the trails to see where it led, but a stronger part of me, the part that had kept me alive and safe through almost 3 decades of trucking, told me to get back in my cab and lock the doors. I did exactly that, but sleep was impossible. I lay in my bunk with every light in the cab turned on, watching the windows and listening for any sound that might indicate the return of whoever had been walking around my truck. The hours crawled by with agonizing slowness, each minute feeling like an hour. Dawn was just starting to lighten the eastern sky when the knocking started again. But this time, it wasn't coming from outside the truck. It was coming from inside the cab, from the other side of the thin wall that separated my sleeper berth from the driver's compartment. Soft, hesitant knocking, like someone gently tapping their knuckles against the sleeper wall. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. I grabbed my flashlight and slowly opened the curtain that divided the sleeper from the main cab. The knocking stopped immediately, but what I saw in the beam of my flashlight made me question my own sanity. Every window in my cab was covered with handprints. Small handprints like those that had been in the sand pressed against the glass from the inside. The prints were fogged into the windows as if made by warm breath on cold glass, but it was impossible. The inside of my cab was cool from the air conditioning and the windows were dry. More importantly, there was no way anyone could have gotten inside my locked truck to make those prints. I touched one of the prints on the driver's side window and it was warm. Not just warm, but hot, like fever heat. As my finger made contact with it, I heard what sounded like a child's giggle, faint and distant, as if it were coming from very far away. That was enough for me. I fired up the engine, not caring about the noise or the fact that I was cutting my rest period short. I had to get away from mile marker 187, away from whatever was happening there. As I pulled back onto the highway, I looked in my mirrors and saw that the handprints were fading from the windows, disappearing like frost melting in sunlight. But the last one to disappear was on the passenger side window, right at eye level. As it faded, it seemed to wave goodbye, the fingers moving in a slow, deliberate gesture that made my blood run cold. I drove straight through to New Orleans without stopping, running on nothing but adrenaline and black coffee. When I finally reached my destination and was unloading the agricultural equipment, one of the dock workers commented on the condition of my truck. "Man," he said, "looks like you drove through a dust storm. Your windows are filthy." I looked at my cab windows and they were covered with a fine layer of dust and grime, as if I'd been driving through a sandstorm. But mixed in with the dust, still faintly visible in the right light, were the outlines of small handprints. Children's handprints pressed against the glass from the inside of my locked cab. I had the truck professionally cleaned that day, paying extra to have every window scrubbed until it sparkled. But sometimes, late at night when I'm driving through the desert, I catch a glimpse of those handprints returning to my windows. And I know that somewhere near mile marker 187 there are children waiting in the darkness for the next trucker foolish enough to stop for the night. My name is Randy Kowalski, and I've been hauling loads across the Southwest for 15 years. I've driven through every kind of weather you can imagine. Blizzards in Colorado, dust storms in Arizona, flash floods in New Mexico. But nothing prepared me for what happened to me on a stretch of highway outside Big Bend National Park on a clear night in September. I was running a load of furniture from Dallas to Tucson, taking Highway 90 west through some of the most desolate country in Texas. It's beautiful during the day with the Chisos Mountains rising like ancient monuments from the desert floor, but at night it becomes something else entirely. The darkness out there is absolute, deeper than any city dweller can imagine. Your headlights seem to barely penetrate it, creating a small bubble of light that moves with you through an ocean of black. It was about 1 a.m. when I first heard her singing. I had the windows down because the air conditioning was acting up, and the desert air was surprisingly cool for September. The radio was turned low, playing some classic country station out of Del Rio, when I heard something that made me reach over and turn it off completely. There was music coming from outside the truck, a woman's voice, singing something I couldn't quite make out. At first, I thought it might be coming from another vehicle. Sometimes you'll hear music from a car passing with its windows down, or catch a fragment of a radio station bleeding through from another truck's CB. But there were no other vehicles on the road. I was alone on this stretch of highway, had been for the last 30 miles and wouldn't see another set of headlights for probably 30 more. I slowed down a bit, trying to locate the source of the singing. The voice was beautiful, clear and pure, with a quality that reminded me of the hymns my grandmother used to sing when I was a kid. But there was something else about it, something that made the hair on my arms stand up. It was too perfect, too precise, like it was being broadcast rather than sung by a living person. The melody was haunting, rising and falling in patterns that seemed familiar but that I couldn't quite place. It was the kind of tune that gets stuck in your head, that you find yourself humming hours later without realizing it. But there were no words I could understand. If there were words at all, it might have been a wordless melody, pure voice carrying across the desert night. As I continued driving, the singing grew louder. Not gradually like you might expect if I were approaching its source, but in distinct jumps, as if someone were turning up the volume on a radio. First it was just barely audible over the sound of my engine and the wind through my windows. Then it was clear and distinct. Then it was loud enough that I had to resist the urge to cover my ears. But the strangest thing was that no matter how loud it got, I could still hear everything else normally. The engine noise didn't get drowned out. The wind didn't disappear. It was as if the singing was being layered on top of reality rather than replacing it. I pulled over at a scenic overlook, one of those places where tourists stop during the day to take pictures of the desert landscape. I shut off the engine and stepped out of the cab, thinking maybe I could figure out where the singing was coming from. The overlook was empty except for my truck, just a small parking area carved into the side of a hill with a spectacular view of the desert valley below. The singing was even louder outside the truck, so loud it seemed to be coming from everywhere at once. It echoed off the canyon walls and bounced back from the mountains, creating a natural amphitheater of sound. But when I looked around, there was absolutely nothing that could be producing it. No buildings, no other people, no vehicles, just me, my truck, and the vast emptiness of the Texas desert. That's when I noticed that I wasn't alone after all. Standing at the far end of the overlook, almost invisible in the darkness, was a woman. She was tall and slender, wearing what looked like a long white dress that seemed to glow faintly in the starlight. Her dark hair hung loose around her shoulders, moving slightly in a breeze I couldn't feel. And she was singing. Her mouth was open, her head tilted back slightly, and the beautiful, haunting melody was pouring out of her like water from a spring. I called out to her, thinking maybe she was in trouble or needed help. "Ma'am, are you okay? Do you need assistance?" She didn't respond, didn't even seem to hear me. She just kept singing. That pure, perfect voice filling the night air with its impossible beauty. I started walking toward her, my boots crunching on the gravel of the parking area. But the closer I got, the more uncomfortable I became. There was something wrong with the way she stood. Too still. Too perfect, like a statue rather than a living person. Her dress wasn't moving in the wind that should have been blowing across the exposed overlook. And her singing never wavered, never paused for breath, never showed any of the small imperfections that make human voices human. When I was about 20 feet away from her, I stopped. Something deep in my brain was screaming at me not to get any closer, every instinct I'd developed in 43 years of life telling me that this woman was not what she appeared to be. I stood there for what felt like hours, but was probably only a few minutes, listening to her sing and trying to work up the courage to either approach her or retreat to my truck. The decision was made for me when she suddenly stopped singing. The silence that followed was so complete it was almost painful. No wind, no insects, no distant traffic, nothing. It was as if the entire desert was holding its breath. The woman slowly turned her head toward me, and even in the darkness I could see her smile. It was a beautiful smile, warm and inviting, but it never reached her eyes. Her eyes were completely black, not just dark brown or dark blue, but black like the desert night around us. She opened her mouth as if to speak, and instead of words, the singing resumed. But now it was different. Where before it had been hauntingly beautiful, now it was overwhelming, almost aggressive in its intensity. It seemed to come from everywhere, not just from her mouth, but from the air itself, from the ground beneath my feet, from inside my own head. I stumbled backward, my hands instinctively going to my ears, but it didn't help. The singing was inside me now, filling my mind, drowning out my thoughts. I felt dizzy, disoriented, like I was losing my grip on reality. The woman began walking toward me, her feet making no sound on the gravel, her white dress flowing around her like water. That's when I ran. I turned and sprinted back to my truck, fumbling with the door handle in my panic, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might explode. I got the engine started and threw the truck into gear, not caring about proper procedures or safety checks. I just had to get away from that overlook, away from that woman and her impossible singing. As I pulled back onto the highway, I looked in my rearview mirror. The woman was standing in the middle of the parking area watching me leave. Even from that distance, even over the noise of my engine, I could still hear her singing. It followed me for miles, gradually fading but never completely disappearing, like an echo that refuses to die. I was about 10 miles down the road when I realized the singing had changed again. Now it sounded like multiple voices, not just one woman, but a whole chorus of them, harmonizing in ways that human voices shouldn't be able to harmonize. It was beautiful and terrible at the same time, like the sound angels might make if angels were not altogether benevolent. The chorus grew stronger as I drove until it seemed like there were hundreds of voices singing together, filling my cab with their otherworldly music. I tried turning the radio back on to drown it out, but the singing was louder than any volume setting. I tried closing the windows, but it made no difference. The sound wasn't coming through the windows anyway. Finally, in desperation, I started singing myself. I chose the first song that came to mind. Amazing Grace, the same hymn my grandmother used to sing, and belted it out as loud as I could. My voice was rough and untrained, nothing like the perfect voices that surrounded me, but it seemed to work. Gradually, the chorus began to fade, as if my human imperfection was somehow antithetical to their supernatural perfection. By the time I reached the outskirts of Alpine, the singing had stopped completely. The desert was quiet again, normal, filled with the usual sounds of wind and distant traffic. I pulled into a truck stop, got out of my cab on shaking legs, and went inside for coffee. The bright fluorescent lights and mundane conversation of other drivers seemed like the most wonderful things in the world. I was about to get back in my truck when I noticed something that made my blood run cold. On my dashboard, right where I always kept a small plastic cactus that a friend had given me as a good luck charm, there was a dead bird. It was a roadrunner, its neck twisted at an unnatural angle, its black eyes staring sightlessly at the windshield. The cactus was gone. In its place was this dead bird, arranged almost ceremoniously in the exact same spot. There was no way it could have gotten into my locked cab. No window or vent large enough for a bird that size to fit through. But there it was, placed with deliberate care in the one spot where I would be sure to see it. I picked up the bird with a paper towel, trying not to look at its lifeless eyes, and threw it in a dumpster behind the truck stop. Then I drove straight through to Tucson without stopping. The radio turned up loud to drown out any sound that might try to creep in from the desert night. But even now, years later, I sometimes hear that singing when I'm driving alone through the desert. It's fainter now, like a memory that's starting to fade, but it's still there. And sometimes, when the night is very quiet and very dark, I hear the chorus again. Hundreds of voices singing in perfect, impossible harmony, calling me back to that overlook outside Big Bend where a woman in white stands waiting for the next traveler foolish enough to stop and listen to her song. And I need to tell you about something that happened to me that still keeps me awake at night, even though it was almost 2 years ago. I've been driving truck for 31 years, seen every mile of highway between Los Angeles and Miami, and I thought I knew every town, every truck stop, every wide spot in the road worth knowing about. But on a run from El Paso to San Antonio, I drove through a town that doesn't exist, at least not anymore. It was late March, and I was hauling a load of auto parts from a warehouse in El Paso to a dealership in San Antonio. It should have been a straightforward run, about 350 miles on highways I'd traveled hundreds of times before. I'd planned to take I-10 to I-35, a route so familiar I could probably drive it in my sleep. But around Junction, I ran into construction delays that backed traffic up for miles. The CB was full of drivers complaining about the wait, and the few cars getting through were reporting at least a 2-hour delay. I couldn't afford to sit in traffic for 2 hours. The auto parts were needed for a rush repair job, and the customer was paying premium rates for expedited delivery. So I did what any experienced driver would do. I got off the interstate and looked for an alternate route. I'd been driving these roads long enough to know there were plenty of state highways that could get me where I needed to go, even if they took a little longer. I pulled out my road atlas. This was before GPS was really reliable in rural areas, and traced a route that would take me north on some back roads, then east to connect with I-35 further up. It would add maybe 50 miles to the trip, but it would keep me moving instead of sitting in traffic, burning fuel and wasting time. The roads looked decent on the map, marked as paved state highways rather than dirt county roads. The detour started out fine. Highway 377 took me through some pretty hill country, past small ranches and fields of bluebonnets that were just starting to bloom. The road was in good condition, not much traffic, and I was making good time. The sun was starting to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that made the whole landscape look like a postcard. About an hour into the detour, as full darkness was settling over the hills, I came over a rise and saw lights ahead. Not just a few scattered ranch lights, but the glow of a real town. Street lights, house lights, business signs. According to my atlas, there shouldn't have been anything there bigger than a crossroads, but I wasn't complaining. Small towns usually meant at least a gas station and maybe a cafe where I could grab a coffee and use the restroom. The town appeared gradually as I descended into a small valley. First, I saw the welcome sign. Welcome to Harmony, population 847. A great place to call home. The sign looked new, the paint fresh and bright in my headlights. Then came the outskirts, neat houses with well-maintained lawns, streetlights that actually worked, sidewalks that weren't cracked and overgrown with weeds. As I drove down what appeared to be the main street, I was impressed by how well kept everything looked. This wasn't one of those dying rural towns you see all over Texas, where half the businesses are boarded up and the other half are barely hanging on. The storefronts were clean and painted with attractive signs and display windows that were actually lit up. There was a hardware store, a pharmacy, a small grocery store, even a movie theater with a vintage marquee advertising current films. But the thing that really caught my attention was the diner. It was one of those classic roadside places, all chrome and neon, with a parking lot full of cars and pickup trucks. The sign said Mel's Diner, open 24 hours, home cooking, and through the windows I could see people inside, sitting at tables and booths, apparently enjoying their meals. My stomach growled, reminding me that I hadn't eaten since lunch, and I started looking for a place to park my rig. I found a spot on a side street where I could park without blocking traffic and walked back to the diner. The night air was crisp and clean, with the smell of mesquite and wildflowers carried on a gentle breeze. I could hear normal small-town sounds, dogs barking in the distance, the murmur of conversation from the diner, the hum of air conditioners, and the occasional car passing on the main street. I was reaching for the diner door when I noticed something odd. Through the large windows I could see people sitting at tables and booths, apparently eating and talking, but I couldn't hear any voices. The parking lot was full of vehicles, but they all had their windows up and I couldn't see anyone inside them. The whole scene had a strange, static quality to it, like a photograph rather than real life. I stood there for a minute, trying to shake off a growing sense of unease. Small towns could be quiet, especially on a weeknight. Maybe the diner had good soundproofing. Maybe the people in the cars were just resting or making phone calls. There were plenty of logical explanations for what I was seeing. I pushed open the diner door and immediately the strangeness intensified. The interior was exactly what you'd expect from a small-town diner. Red vinyl booths, black and white checkered. Floor, a long counter with stools, the smell of coffee and fried food. But while I could see people sitting at the tables and booths, they didn't seem to notice me when I walked in. No one looked up, no hostess came to seat me, no waitress asked if I wanted coffee. I stood by the door for a moment, waiting for someone to acknowledge my presence, but nothing happened. The people continued their conversations, but I couldn't make out any words. It was like listening to a radio that wasn't quite tuned to the station, all static and whispers. I walked over to the counter and tried to get the attention of a waitress who was standing behind it, apparently writing on an order pad, but she didn't look up when I spoke to her. That's when I noticed that while I could see the people clearly, they seemed somehow insubstantial, like they weren't entirely there. Their edges were slightly blurred and they cast no shadows despite the bright overhead lights. The food on their tables looked real enough, but I never saw anyone actually take a bite. They would lift forks or cups to their mouths in the motions of eating and drinking, but the food never seemed to diminish. I backed toward the door, my skin crawling with the wrongness of it all. This wasn't a real diner with real people. It was like a stage set, a simulation of a diner populated by actors who were only going through the motions of living. I pushed out through the door and hurried back toward my truck, my heart pounding with a fear I couldn't quite explain. But as I walked through the town, I realized that the strangeness extended far beyond the diner. All the houses had lights in their windows, but I never saw anyone moving inside them. The cars parked on the streets looked real enough, but their license plates were blank, just smooth metal rectangles with no numbers or letters. The movie theater was advertising current films, but when I looked closely at the posters, the text was gibberish. Strings of letters that didn't form actual words. I reached my truck and climbed into the cab, eager to get out of Harmony and back onto roads that made sense. But when I tried to start the engine, nothing happened. The key turned, the dashboard lights came on, but the engine wouldn't catch. I tried again and again, pumping the gas pedal, checking the gauges, but the truck was completely dead. This was a truck I'd maintained meticulously, that had never failed to start, that had carried me safely across hundreds of thousands of miles. There was no reason for it not to start, but it sat there silent and useless while I grew more and more panicked. I got out and popped the hood, shining my flashlight on the engine. Everything looked normal. No loose connections, no obvious problems, all the fluids at proper levels. But when I touched the engine block, it was stone cold, as if the truck had been sitting there for hours instead of the few minutes since I'd parked it. I was starting to seriously panic when I heard footsteps on the sidewalk behind me. I turned around and saw a man walking toward me, the first person in Harmony who seemed to actually see me. He was middle-aged, wearing khakis and a polo shirt, looking like any small-town resident out for an evening walk. But there was something wrong with his smile, something too wide, too eager. "Having trouble with your truck?" he asked, his voice pleasant but somehow hollow, like an echo of a voice rather than the real thing. "Yeah, it won't start," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. "Engine was running fine when I parked it." "Oh, that happens sometimes," he said, still smiling that unsettling smile. "Harmony has a way of making visitors want to stay a while. Why don't you come have some coffee at Mel's? Maybe try again in the morning." Everything about this suggestion terrified me. The idea of spending the night in this impossible town, of trying to sleep while surrounded by these shadow people going through the motions of living, filled me with a dread so profound I could barely think straight. "No thanks," I managed. "I really need to get back on the road tonight." The man's smile flickered for just a moment, and in that instant I saw something else in his face. Something hungry and predatory that made my blood freeze. Then the smile returned, as wide and false as before. "Are you sure?" he asked. "Harmony is a great place to call home." He repeated the exact words from the welcome sign, and the way he said them made me realize he wasn't really talking to me. He was reciting lines from a script, playing a role in some cosmic theater I didn't understand. I backed toward my truck, keeping my eyes on him. "I'm sure." "Thanks anyway." I climbed back into the cab and tried the key again, and this time, miracle of miracles, the engine turned over on the first try. It roared to life as if nothing had ever been wrong with it, all gauges reading normal, everything functioning perfectly. I didn't waste time wondering why. I threw the truck in gear and got the hell out of Harmony as fast as I could without running over the man who was still standing on the sidewalk, still smiling his terrible smile. I drove straight through the night, following my Atlas back to I-35 and then on to San Antonio. I delivered the auto parts on time, but I couldn't stop thinking about what had happened. The more I thought about it, the more convinced I became that I'd experienced something that shouldn't have been possible. A week later, I was back in the area for another delivery, and curiosity got the better of me. I tried to find Harmony again, following the same route I'd taken before. I found Highway 377, found the place where I'd turned off to avoid construction, followed what I thought was the same path through the hill country. But there was no town. The valley where Harmony had been was empty, just rolling hills covered with mesquite and prickly pear. No buildings, no roads, no sign that anyone had ever lived there. I stopped and walked around looking for some trace of what I'd seen, but there was nothing. Not even foundations or ruins that might have been left from an abandoned town. I checked my atlas again, studied every map I could find, even looked up the area on the internet when I got home. There had never been a town called Harmony in that part of Texas. No record of it in census data, no mention in local history books, no evidence that it had ever existed. But I knew what I'd seen. I'd walked through that town, tried to eat in that diner, talked to that man with his horrible smile. It had been as real as anything I'd ever experienced, more real than some actual places I'd been. The question that haunts me is whether Harmony exists in some parallel version of Texas, slipping in and out of our reality like a mirage, or whether I somehow drove through a place that exists only in the spaces between what's real and what's possible. I've taken that same route dozens of times since then, always looking for any sign of Harmony, but I've never seen it again. Sometimes, though, when I'm driving through unfamiliar territory at night, I see lights in the distance that look like a town where my maps say there should be nothing. And I always take a different route because I know that some invitations are too dangerous to accept, and some places that seem welcoming are actually traps for the unwary. If you're ever driving through rural Texas at night and you see a town that's not on your map, a place that looks too perfect, too welcoming, too eager to make you feel at home, keep driving. Don't stop for gas, don't stop for food, don't stop to ask directions. Because Harmony might be a great place to call home, but it's not a place you ever want to leave. Luis Hernandez here, and what I'm about to tell you happened to me on a run from Amarillo to Corpus Christi, hauling what should have been an empty trailer. I say should have been because by the time I reached my destination, I learned that sometimes empty doesn't mean empty, and sometimes the cargo you're carrying isn't what you think it is. I'd been driving for Rodriguez Trucking for about 8 years at the time, mostly running loads throughout Texas and the surrounding states. It was good, steady work, and I'd developed a reputation for being reliable and professional. So when dispatch called and asked if I could do a favor for a regular customer, I didn't hesitate to say yes. The job seemed simple enough. I needed to pick up an empty trailer in Amarillo and haul it to Corpus Christi, where it would be loaded with seafood for a run back north. The trailer had been sitting in a warehouse yard for a couple of weeks after being unloaded, and the customer wanted it moved to a different facility. Easy money. No loading or unloading, no special permits or hazardous materials certifications. Just a straightforward drive across the state with an empty box behind me. I picked up the trailer on a Tuesday morning. It was a standard 53-foot dry van, maybe 10 years old but well-maintained, with no external damage or anything unusual about its appearance. The yard foreman walked around it with me, checking the tires and lights, and handed me the paperwork. According to the bills of lading, the trailer had last carried agricultural equipment, tractors and plows and such, and had been cleaned and inspected after unloading. I hooked up to the trailer, did my pre-trip inspection, and headed south on US 287. The weather was clear, traffic was light, and I was making good time. The trailer pulled smoothly behind me, no unusual vibrations or handling problems, and I settled in for what I expected to be an uneventful 400-mile drive. About an hour into the trip, somewhere south of Amarillo, I started hearing a sound that made me frown and check my mirrors. It was a faint rattling coming from the trailer, like something loose was rolling around back there. Not unusual in itself, even empty trailers often have some debris left behind. Maybe a loose bolt or a piece of cardboard that didn't get swept out. But this rattling had an odd quality to it, a rhythm that seemed almost deliberate. I pulled over at a truck stop outside of Childress and walked back to check the trailer doors. They were still sealed with the tamper-evident tags the warehouse had put on them, and the locks were secure. The rattling had stopped when I parked, so I figured whatever was loose had settled into place. I got back in the cab and continued south, but as soon as I got back up to highway speed, the rattling started again, and this time I could hear it more clearly. It wasn't just one object rolling around. It sounded like multiple things, small and hard, bouncing against the walls and floor of the trailer as I drove. The sound had a hollow quality to it, like pieces of wood or plastic knocking together. Over the next hour, the rattling grew louder and more persistent. Sometimes it would stop for a few minutes, giving me hope that whatever was causing it had finally settled. But then it would start again, often louder than before. By the time I reached the outskirts of Wichita Falls, it was loud enough that I could hear it over the road noise in my radio. The sound was starting to get on my nerves in a way I couldn't quite explain. There was something about the rhythm of it that seemed wrong, like it wasn't random but was following some pattern I couldn't quite discern. Sometimes it sounded like Morse code, sometimes like a drum beat, sometimes like the clicking of bones. though that comparison didn't occur to me until later. I stopped for lunch at a truck stop in Wichita Falls, hoping that a longer break would give whatever was loose time to settle. But when I walked around to the back of the trailer, I could swear I heard the rattling continuing even though the truck was parked and shut off. It was fainter now, but still audible, like something was moving around in there on its own. I stood there for several minutes, listening carefully and trying to convince myself I was imagining things. Trailers don't make noise when they're not moving. There's no engine, no moving parts, nothing that could cause sounds except cargo shifting during transport. But I knew what I was hearing, and it definitely sounded like something was active inside that supposedly empty trailer. I considered calling dispatch to report the problem, but what would I tell them? That I was hearing mysterious rattling from an empty trailer? That whatever was making the noise seemed to have a life of its own? They'd think I was losing my mind, or worse, that I was making excuses to avoid completing the delivery. So I got back on the road, telling myself that I was overthinking things. The trailer was sealed, the paperwork said it was empty, and I was probably just hearing normal road noise amplified by the hollow box behind me. But as I headed south on I-35, the rattling not only continued, but seemed to get more agitated, more urgent. By the time I reached the outskirts of Austin, the noise was so loud and persistent that other drivers were starting to notice. A driver in a pickup truck pulled alongside me and gestured toward my trailer, then made the universal pull-over sign. I could see concern on his face, and I realized that whatever was happening wasn't just in my head. I pulled off at the next truck stop, a large facility with plenty of parking and good lighting. As soon as I shut off the engine, the rattling stopped abruptly, leaving an eerie silence that was somehow worse than the noise had been. I sat in my cab for a moment, gathering courage for what I knew I had to do. I had to open that trailer and see what was inside. I walked back to the rear of the trailer, my hands shaking slightly as I cut the security seals and unlocked the doors. The hinges creaked as I swung them open, and my flashlight beam swept across the interior of the trailer. It was empty, completely, totally empty, just as the paperwork had indicated. The floor was clean, the walls were bare, and there was no cargo, no debris, no loose objects that could have been causing the rattling. But as I stood there, shining my light into every corner of the trailer, I smelled something that made my stomach turn. It was the smell of old bones, dry and dusty, like what you might find in a desert where an animal had died and been picked clean by scavengers. The smell was faint but unmistakable, and it seemed to be coming from the trailer itself, as if it had soaked into the metal walls and wooden floor. I was about to close the doors and chalk the whole thing up to my imagination when I saw it. In the exact center of the trailer floor, where my flashlight beam created a bright circle of light, was a single human jawbone. It was old and yellowed, definitely human, with several teeth still attached. It was lying there as if it had been carefully placed, positioned perfectly in the middle of the empty trailer like some kind of grotesque decoration. There was no way it could have been missed during the cleaning and inspection that was supposed to have been done after the last load was removed. I stood there staring at that jawbone for what felt like hours, but was probably only a minute or two. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. How had it gotten there? Why was it positioned so precisely? And what did it have to do with the rattling I'd been hearing? As if in answer to my questions, the bone moved. Not rolled or shifted, but moved with purpose, spinning in place like a compass needle seeking magnetic north. As it spun, I heard that familiar rattling sound, but now I could see its source. The teeth in the jawbone were chattering against each other, creating the rhythmic clicking I'd been hearing for the past 200 miles. I stumbled backward, nearly falling off the trailer dock. My heart hammering with terror, the bone stopped spinning and settled into stillness, but I could swear I heard something like laughter echoing from the empty trailer. Dry, brittle laughter like wind through dead leaves. I slammed the trailer doors shut and leaned against them, my whole body shaking. I needed to call the police or my dispatcher or somebody who could tell me what to do with a haunted trailer and a human jawbone that moved on its own. But even as I was thinking about it, I realized how crazy it would sound. No one would believe me, and I'd probably lose my job and my reputation in the process. So I did what truckers do when faced with impossible situations. I improvised. I got back in my cab, fired up the engine, and drove straight through to Corpus Christi, not stopping except for fuel. The rattling continued the whole way, sometimes soft and subtle, sometimes loud enough to be heard over my radio. But I tried to ignore it and focus on the road. When I reached the delivery location in Corpus Christi, I backed up to the dock and waited for the warehouse crew to open the trailer doors. I watched their faces carefully, wondering if they would see what I had seen, but they showed no surprise or concern. They simply looked into the empty trailer, made a note on their clipboard, and told me I could unhook and be on my way. "Everything look okay back there?" I asked, trying to sound casual. "Empty and clean," the dock foreman replied. "Just like it's supposed to be." I wanted to ask him about the jawbone to see if he'd noticed it, but something held me back. Maybe it was cowardice, or maybe it was a growing suspicion that whatever was in that trailer was meant for me alone to see. I unhitched the trailer and drove to a nearby truck stop where I called dispatch to report that the delivery was complete. Everything was routine and normal, they told me. The customer was satisfied, and I had a new load assignment waiting for pickup the next morning. But that night, as I tried to sleep in my cab, I dreamed about that jawbone. I dreamed about bones rattling in empty trailers, about teeth chattering in the darkness, about dry laughter echoing across the Texas highways. And when I woke up, I found a single human tooth lying on my dashboard, old and yellowed just like the ones I'd seen in that jawbone. I threw the tooth out the window and never spoke about what happened in that trailer. But sometimes, late at night, when I'm pulling an empty trailer across the desert highways of Texas, I hear that familiar rattling behind me. And I know that somewhere out there in trailers that are supposed to be empty, bones are still dancing in the darkness, and the dead are still trying to hitch a ride to destinations that no living person would ever want to visit. Bobby Chen speaking. And I've been driving for 22 years, mostly long-haul routes from the West Coast to the Southeast. I've seen every kind of strange thing you can imagine on the highways. Phantom hitchhikers, UFOs, mysterious lights in the sky. But nothing prepared me for what I saw in my rearview mirror on a run from Phoenix to Houston last summer. It was mid-July, one of those brutally hot desert nights where the temperature doesn't drop below 90 even after sunset. I was running a load of electronics, trying to make good time across Arizona and New Mexico before hitting the Texas border around midnight. The air conditioning in my cab was working overtime, but I still had the windows cracked to keep from falling asleep. The sound of wind helps me stay alert during long night drives. I'd been on the road for about 6 hours, somewhere in the middle of nowhere west of El Paso, when I first noticed something odd about my rearview mirror. It was around 2 a.m., and traffic was practically non-existent. I hadn't seen another vehicle for the better part of an hour, just mile after mile of empty highway stretching behind me into the darkness. But in my mirror, instead of seeing the usual view of the empty road and my trailer, I caught a glimpse of something that made me do a double take. For just a split second, it looked like there was someone sitting in my sleeper berth, a man, middle-aged, with dark hair and a mustache, wearing what looked like a flannel shirt. He appeared to be grinning at me like he knew some joke I wasn't in on. I jerked my head around to look directly at the sleeper berth, but it was empty, just as it should have been. My pillow was there, my blanket, my small bag of personal items, but no person. I looked back at the mirror, and all I saw was the normal view of the highway behind me. I shook my head, figuring I was more tired than I'd realized, and cranked the air conditioning up another notch to help me stay alert. But about 20 minutes later, it happened again. I glanced in the rearview mirror and there he was. The same man, still grinning, still wearing that flannel shirt. This time I got a better look at him. He looked to be in his 40s with graying hair and deep-set eyes that seemed to sparkle with amusement. He was sitting on the edge of my bunk, his hands folded in his lap, watching me with obvious interest. Again, I spun around to look directly at the sleeper berth, and again, there was nothing there. Just my empty bunk and the familiar surroundings of my home away from home. But when I looked back at the mirror, the man was still there, and now he was waving at me. A slow, deliberate wave, like he was greeting an old friend. My hands tightened on the steering wheel, and I felt sweat breaking out on my forehead despite the air conditioning. I'd heard stories from other drivers about seeing things in their mirrors, phantom vehicles, ghost towns, faces that shouldn't be there, but I'd always figured it was just fatigue or tricks of light and shadow. Now I was experiencing it firsthand, and it was terrifying in a way I couldn't quite put into words. I tried ignoring the mirror, focusing on the road ahead and the rhythm of my engine, but I found my eyes being drawn back to it every few minutes, almost against my will. And every time I looked, the man was still there, still grinning, still watching me with those amused eyes. Sometimes he would change position, leaning back against my pillow, sitting forward with his elbows on his knees, or standing up and moving around the small space of the sleeper berth. The strangest part was how normal he looked. He didn't appear ghostly or transparent or any of the things you might expect from a supernatural vision. He looked as solid and real as I did, just a regular guy in a flannel shirt who happened to be sitting in my truck. If I hadn't known for certain that my sleeper berth was empty, I would have sworn he was actually there. Around 3 a.m., I pulled into a truck stop outside of Van Horn, needing fuel and hoping that getting out of the cab would somehow reset whatever was happening with my mirror. I filled up my tanks, did a quick walk-around inspection of my truck, and went inside for coffee and a sandwich. The fluorescent lights and mundane conversation of the other drivers felt wonderfully normal after the weirdness of the past hour. When I got back in my cab, I immediately checked the rearview mirror. Empty road, normal view, no mysterious passenger in my sleeper berth. I breathed a sigh of relief and got back on the highway, telling myself that whatever I'd been seeing was just a product of fatigue and too much caffeine. But as soon as I was back up to cruising speed, he appeared again. This time he seemed to be making himself at home in my sleeper berth. He was lying on my bunk, his hands behind his head, looking completely relaxed and comfortable. When he saw me looking in the mirror, he sat up and gave me a little salute, like he was acknowledging my return. Over the next 2 hours, as I drove through the Texas night toward El Paso, the man in my mirror became more and more active. He would move around the sleeper berth, examining my belongings, picking up my books and magazines and flipping through them. Sometimes he would lie down and appear to be sleeping, but other times he would sit up and watch me driving, that constant grin never leaving his face. The most unnerving part was that he seemed to be responding to my actions. When I changed lanes, he would brace himself against the wall of the sleeper berth as if feeling the truck's movement. When I turned up the radio, he would cock his head as if listening to the music. When I took a drink from my coffee cup, he would mime drinking from an invisible cup of his own. I tried talking to him, feeling ridiculous but desperate for some kind of interaction. "Who are you?" I asked, speaking to the rearview mirror. "What do you want?" The man's grin widened, and he pointed to himself, then to me, then made a gesture that seemed to encompass the entire truck. Then he mouthed something that I couldn't quite make out, but it looked like he was saying, "Thank you." "Thank you for what?" I asked, but he just kept grinning and shaking his head like he was amused by my confusion. As I approached El Paso, the eastern sky was starting to lighten with the first hints of dawn. I was exhausted, not just from the long night of driving, but from the constant stress of having this uninvited passenger in my mirror. I decided to stop at a truck stop on the outskirts of the city, get some real sleep, and hope that whatever was happening would resolve itself in the daylight. I found a parking spot away from the main traffic areas, shut down the engine, and went through my usual pre-sleep routine. But before settling in for the night, or what was left of it, I took one more look in the rearview mirror. The man was gone. The mirror showed only the normal view of the parking lot behind me, with a few other trucks scattered around under the fluorescent lights. I felt a wave of relief wash over me, followed immediately by exhaustion. Whatever had been happening was over, and I could finally get some rest. I climbed into the sleeper berth, pulled the curtain closed, and lay down on my bunk. The pillow felt comfortable against my head, and I was starting to drift off to sleep when I noticed something that made my eyes snap open in terror. My pillow smelled like tobacco and sweat. Not my own sweat. I don't smoke, and I'd showered that morning before starting my run. This was someone else's smell. The scent of a person who'd been lying on my pillow, using my bed, making himself at home in my private space. I jumped up and turned on every light in the sleeper berth, examining the pillow closely. There was a slight depression in it, as if someone's head had been resting there. The blanket was rumpled in a way that suggested it had been disturbed, not by my movements but by someone else lying under it. I stripped the bedding off my bunk and threw it in a bag, planning to wash it at the earliest opportunity. Then I spent the next hour going through every inch of my sleeper berth, looking for any other signs that my mysterious passenger had left behind. I found nothing else unusual, but that smell lingered. Tobacco and sweat and something else I couldn't identify. Something that reminded me of old leather and campfires. I never slept that night. I sat in my driver's seat watching the sunrise and trying to make sense of what had happened. By the time I was ready to get back on the road, the whole experience felt like a dream, something that couldn't possibly have been real. But as I pulled out of the truck stop and merged back onto the highway toward Houston, I caught a glimpse of movement in my peripheral vision. I looked in the rearview mirror, and there he was again. The man in the flannel shirt, sitting on my freshly stripped bunk, grinning that familiar grin. He raised his hand and wiggled his fingers at me like he was saying hello after a brief absence. This time, though, something was different. This time I could see him not just in the mirror, but in my direct vision as well. When I turned around to look at the sleeper berth, he was there, solid and real as life, sitting on my bunk and watching me with those amused eyes. "Hello, Bobby," he said, his voice clear and conversational. "Thanks for the ride. I've been waiting a long time for a driver like you, someone who could see me, someone who wasn't afraid to share his truck with a traveling companion." I pulled over immediately, my hands shaking so badly I could barely steer. "What do you want?" I managed to ask. "Just a ride," he said. "I've been hitchhiking these highways for longer than you can imagine, but most drivers can't see me. They drive right past, leaving me standing on the shoulder. You're different, Bobby. You've got the sight. You can see things that others can't." "But you're not real," I said. "You can't be real." He laughed, a warm, genuine sound that somehow made the situation even more terrifying. "Define real, Bobby. I'm sitting here talking to you. You can see me, hear me, smell me. What's more real than that?" I fumbled for my CB radio, thinking I could call for help, but he shook his head. "They won't be able to see me, Bobby. As far as anyone else is concerned, you're talking to an empty sleeper berth. They'll think you've lost your mind." And that's when I realized the true horror of my situation. I was trapped in my own truck with a passenger who existed only for me, who could interact with my environment and leave his scent on my pillow, but who would be invisible to everyone else. Whether he was a ghost A hallucination or something else entirely. I was alone with him on the highways of America, and no one would ever believe me if I tried to explain what was happening. The man, I never did learn his name, though I asked many times, rode with me for the rest of that trip and for several trips afterward. He was always polite, always grateful for the company, always careful not to interfere with my driving. But he was also always there, a constant presence in my peripheral vision, a reminder that the world is full of passengers who are looking for rides to destinations that may not exist on any map. Eventually, somewhere outside of Nashville on a rainy night in October, he thanked me one final time and simply faded away, leaving behind only the faint scent of tobacco and the memory of his amused grin. I never saw him again, but sometimes when I'm driving alone at night and feeling the weight of solitude that comes with life on the road, I catch a whiff of that familiar smell and know that somewhere out there he's still traveling the highways, still looking for drivers who can see beyond the ordinary world into the spaces where the impossible becomes everyday reality. Steve Williams here, and I'm going to tell you about something that happened to me while crossing a dry wash near Marathon, Texas, that still gives me nightmares 3 years later. I've been a long-haul driver for 16 years, running mostly through the Southwest, and I thought I'd seen everything these desert highways had to offer. But what I encountered that night proved me wrong in the most terrifying way possible. It was late September, and I was hauling a load of construction materials from Albuquerque to San Antonio, taking Highway 90 through some of the most remote and beautiful country in Texas. The Big Bend region has always been one of my favorite areas to drive through. During the day, anyway. The landscape is stark and magnificent, with mountains rising from the desert floor like ancient monuments and vast expanses of scrubland that stretch to the horizon in every direction. But at night, that same landscape can feel oppressive and alien, like you've driven onto the surface of another planet. The darkness out there is absolute, deeper than anything you'll find in more populated areas. Your headlights become your whole world, creating a small bubble of visibility that moves with you through an ocean of black. I was about 50 miles east of Alpine when I came to a section of highway that crosses a series of dry washes. Arroyos, the locals call them. These are natural drainage channels that carry water during the brief but intense thunderstorms that occasionally sweep across the desert. Most of the year, though, they're bone dry, just sandy-bottomed gullies that cut across the landscape like ancient scars. The highway dips down into these washes and then climbs back out, creating a series of small hills and valleys that can play tricks on your depth perception, especially at night. I'd driven this section dozens of times before, always during daylight hours, so I slowed down and paid extra attention to the road ahead. It was around 11 p.m. and there was no other traffic in sight. I hadn't seen another vehicle for the past 30 minutes, and according to my GPS, the next town of any size was still over an hour away. The night was clear and still, with a canopy of stars so bright and numerous that they seemed close enough to touch. I was descending into one of the larger washes when my headlights swept across something that made me ease off the accelerator and lean forward to get a better look. Standing in the sandy bottom of the wash, arranged in what appeared to be a perfect line stretching from one side to the other, were dozens of tall, thin figures. At first glance, they looked like people, very tall, very thin people standing motionless in the sand. But as my headlights played across them, I could see that something was wrong with their proportions. They were too tall, maybe 8 or 9 feet in height, and so thin they seemed almost skeletal. Their arms hung at their sides, and they appeared to be wearing long, dark robes or coats that didn't move in what should have been a desert breeze. I slowed to a crawl, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. My first thought was that it might be some kind of art installation. I'd heard of artists creating temporary sculptures in remote locations, and the Big Bend area attracted all kinds of creative types. but the figures were too numerous, too perfectly arranged, and too unsettling to be any kind of conventional artwork. As I got closer, more details became visible in the wash of my headlights. The figures all faced the same direction, toward the road, toward me, but they had no visible faces. Where their faces should have been, there was only darkness, as if they were wearing deep hoods that completely shadowed their features. They stood perfectly still, not moving or swaying or showing any signs of life. I brought my truck to a complete stop at the edge of the wash, my engine idling as I tried to decide what to do. The rational part of my mind was telling me that these had to be some kind of natural formation. Maybe unusual rock formations or dead trees that looked like human figures in the deceptive light of my headlights. But another part of me, the part that had kept me alive and safe through 16 years of long-haul driving, was screaming at me to get the hell out of there as fast as possible. I sat there for maybe 30 seconds, studying the figures and trying to convince myself they were harmless. That's when I noticed that the arrangement wasn't random at all. The figures were positioned in a perfect line across the wash, spaced exactly the same distance apart, like soldiers in formation or chess pieces on a board, and they were all exactly the same height, exactly the same impossible thinness, exactly the same dark coloring. I was reaching for the gear shift, planning to put the truck in reverse and find an alternate route, when the figures moved. Not all at once, but in a wave that started from the left side of the formation and rippled across to the right. One by one, they turned their heads toward my truck. Not their bodies. Their bodies remained facing forward, perfectly still and upright. Just their heads turning with mechanical precision to focus on me. Even through the darkness of their hoods, I could feel them watching me. It was like being studied by a panel of judges, evaluated by something inhuman and unknowable. The feeling was so intense that I actually ducked down in my seat, as if their invisible gaze was something physical I could avoid. That's when I heard the whispering. At first, I thought it was just the sound of wind through my partially open windows. But as I listened more carefully, I realized it was voices. Multiple voices speaking in whispers so soft they were barely audible. The words were unintelligible, not English or Spanish or any language I could identify, but there was a rhythm to them that suggested conversation or maybe chanting. I rolled down my driver's side window completely, and the whispering became more distinct. It was definitely voices, dozens of them, all speaking at once in that same soft, sibilant tone. The sound seemed to be coming from the wash itself, from the direction of the dark figures carried on a hot wind that shouldn't have been blowing on such a still night. As I listened, some of the whispers began to sound more familiar. I started to make out what might have been words in English, fragments of sentences that seemed to be calling my name. Steve, I heard, or thought I heard. Steve Williams. And then something that sounded like, "Come down, Steve. Come join us, Steve." The rational part of my mind was telling me it was just the wind, just my imagination turning natural sounds into something sinister. But the whispering was too organized, too purposeful to be anything but intentional communication. And the fact that they seemed to know my name, a name that wasn't printed anywhere on my truck or visible to anyone standing in that wash, filled me with a terror I'd never experienced before. I gunned the engine, intending to back up and get away from whatever was happening in that wash, but the truck didn't respond. The engine revved, but we didn't move. I tried again, giving it more gas, but nothing happened. It was as if the truck was stuck, held in place by some invisible force. I looked at the figures again, and my blood turned to ice. They had moved closer. Not walked or run, but simply appeared several feet nearer to my truck than they had been moments before. The perfect line they had formed was now a semicircle with me at the center, and they were still, turning their invisible faces toward me with that mechanical precision. The whispering grew louder, more insistent. I could definitely hear my name now, repeated over and over by dozens of voices, mixed with other words that sounded like invitations or commands. "Come down, Steve. Join us, Steve. You belong with us, Steve." I tried the engine again, this time putting the truck in drive and flooring the accelerator. For a moment, nothing happened, and I thought I was truly trapped. But then the truck lurched forward, breaking free from whatever had been holding it, and I drove straight down into the wash toward the line of dark figures. I expected to hit them or at least force them to move aside. But as my headlights swept over them, they simply vanished. One second they were there, solid and imposing and terrifyingly real, and the next second they were gone, leaving nothing but empty sand and the smell of something old and dry, like dust and ancient bones. I didn't slow down. I kept my foot on the accelerator and drove up out of the wash as fast as my loaded truck would allow, not caring about the strain on my engine or the possibility of losing control on the steep grade. All I cared about was getting away from that place, putting as much distance as possible between me and whatever I had encountered. But as I reached the crest of the hill on the far side of the wash, I made the mistake of looking in my rear-view mirrors. The wash behind me was full of movement, tall, thin shadows dancing in the moonlight, dozens of them, maybe hundreds. They moved like smoke or mist flowing across the sand in patterns that hurt to look at, swirling and reforming in configurations that seemed to follow mathematical rules I didn't understand. And they were following me. The shadows flowed up out of the wash and onto the highway, moving faster than any living thing should be able to move, gaining on my truck despite the fact that I was doing 70 miles per hour. I could see them in my mirrors, a dark tide of impossible figures pursuing me across the desert night. I pushed the truck harder, bringing my speed up to 80, then 85. The engine was screaming and the trailer was swaying dangerously behind me, but I didn't care. I had to outrun those shadows, had to reach some place where whatever rules governed their existence no longer applied. The pursuit continued for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. Every time I checked my mirrors, the shadows were there, sometimes close enough that I could see individual figures in the dark mass, sometimes falling back but never disappearing completely. They flowed along the highway like water, like smoke, like nothing that belonged in the natural world. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the pursuit stopped. I looked in my mirrors and saw only empty highway stretching back into the darkness. The shadows were gone, vanished as completely as they had appeared. I gradually reduced my speed to something approaching legal and tried to process what had just happened. I drove straight through to San Antonio without stopping, not even for fuel. I couldn't bear the thought of getting out of my truck while I was still in that vast, empty landscape where such things could exist. It was only when I reached the outskirts of the city, with its lights and traffic and reassuring signs of human civilization, that I finally allowed myself to believe I was safe. I delivered my load on schedule, but I never drove Highway 90 through that section of desert again. I found alternate routes, even if they added hours to my trips, because I couldn't face the possibility of encountering those figures a second time. Other drivers noticed my route changes and asked about them, but I never told anyone what I had seen. Who would believe such a story? But sometimes, late at night, when I'm driving through remote areas, I catch glimpses of tall, thin shadows in my peripheral vision. They're usually too far away to see clearly, standing in fields or on distant hillsides. But they're always arranged in that same perfect formation, always facing toward the road, always watching. And sometimes, when the wind is just right and the night is very quiet, I hear whispers carried on the desert air. They're calling names, not always mine, but the names of other drivers, other travelers foolish enough to venture into places where the boundaries between the possible and impossible grow thin. The whispers promise companionship, belonging, a place in their eternal formation. But I keep driving, keep my windows rolled up and my radio turned loud, because I know that some invitations are too dangerous to accept, and some shadows are darker than the absence of light. The desert is full of things that hunt for lonely travelers, and the wise driver learns to recognize them and keep moving no matter how compelling their whispered promises might be. Story 8. The Midnight Toll Booth. Kurt Schneider here. And I want to tell you about a night that changed everything I thought I knew about the highways I've been driving for the past 19 years. It happened on a run from Houston to Phoenix on what should have been a routine trip along highways I'd traveled dozens of times before. But sometimes the familiar roads can become unfamiliar in ways that challenge everything you believe about the nature of reality. I was running a load of medical equipment, time-sensitive stuff that needed to be in Phoenix by Thursday morning for a surgery that couldn't be delayed. The customer was paying premium rates for expedited delivery, so I was pushing hard, trying to make the best time possible while still staying within legal driving hours. I'd left Houston on Tuesday afternoon and was making good progress across Texas, planning to cross into New Mexico sometime after midnight. It was one of those perfect nights for driving. Clear skies, moderate temperatures, light traffic. I had the radio tuned to a classic rock station out of San Antonio, and my truck was running smoothly, eating up the miles with mechanical precision. The desert landscape rolled by outside my windows, illuminated by a nearly full moon that turned the scrubland silver and cast sharp shadows across the highway. I was somewhere between Fort Stockton and the New Mexico border, on a stretch of I-10 that's as straight and empty as any highway in America, when I saw lights ahead that shouldn't have been there. Not headlights or taillights, but the fixed lights of a structure. Bright, artificial illumination that seemed out of place in the vast emptiness of the West Texas desert. As I got closer, the lights resolved into something that made me frown and check my GPS. It was a toll booth. A modern-looking structure with multiple lanes and the kind of electronic signs and barriers you'd expect to find approaching a major city or crossing a state line. But according to my GPS, I was still in the middle of nowhere, at least 50 miles from the nearest town of any size. I slowed down, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. I-10 through this section of Texas is a free highway. No tolls, no restrictions, just open road from the Louisiana border to the New Mexico line. There was no reason for a toll booth to exist here, and yet there it was, brightly lit and apparently operational, with electronic signs directing traffic into different lanes. Most of the lanes were blocked by barriers and flashing red lights. But one lane, the far right lane, was open with a green light above it and a sign that read "All vehicles, $3.50. There was even an attendant visible in the booth, a pale figure in what looked like a dark uniform waiting behind the bulletproof glass. I had two choices: stop and pay the toll, or find some way around the installation. But the toll booth stretched across all lanes of the highway, and there didn't appear to be any shoulder wide enough for a truck and trailer to pass. The barriers on either side of the highway were too high and too close to attempt an off-road detour. So I did what any reasonable driver would do. I pulled into the open lane and stopped at the booth. The attendant was visible through the glass, though the lighting made it hard to see his face clearly. He seemed to be wearing some kind of official uniform, dark blue or black, with a peaked cap that cast shadows over his features. I rolled down my window and leaned out to speak to him. "Evening," I said, trying to sound casual despite my confusion. "I didn't know there was a toll on this section of highway." The attendant didn't respond verbally, just held up 3 fingers, and then pointed to a sign that displayed $3.50 in bright LED numbers. His movements were stiff and mechanical, like someone going through the motions of a job they'd performed thousands of times. $3.50, right? I said, reaching for my wallet. The whole situation felt surreal, like I was participating in some kind of elaborate theater piece, but I figured it was easier to pay the toll than to argue about whether it should exist. Maybe there was construction ahead, or some kind of temporary revenue enhancement I hadn't heard about. I handed the attendant a $5 bill through the small opening in the bulletproof glass. He took it with fingers that seemed too long and too pale and made change with the same mechanical precision he'd shown before. The coins he handed back were cold, colder than they should have been, cold enough to make me wonder if the booth was refrigerated for some reason. "Have a safe trip," the attendant said, his voice muffled by the glass and barely audible over the sound of my idling engine. There was something wrong with his voice. It was too flat, too emotionless, like a recording played at the wrong speed. The barrier in front of my truck lifted with a mechanical whir, and I drove through, still trying to process what had just happened. In my rearview mirrors, I could see the toll booth receding behind me, its lights still bright against the desert darkness. The attendant was visible in the booth, apparently waiting for the next customer. I drove for about a mile, following I-10 as it curved slightly to the northwest, when I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The highway ahead was ending, not merging with another road or splitting into different routes, but simply ending, terminating in a wall of desert sand and scrub brush that blocked any further progress. I slowed to a stop about 100 yards from the end of the pavement, unable to believe what I was seeing. The highway just stopped, as if whoever had been building it had run out of money or materials or interest and simply abandoned the project. But that was impossible. I-10 was a completed interstate highway, part of the federal highway system that connected Los Angeles to Jacksonville. It didn't just end in the middle of the Texas desert. I checked my GPS, but the screen was showing nothing but static, the satellite signal apparently lost. My CB radio was dead too. No chatter from other drivers, no background noise, just silence. Even my cell phone showed no signal, despite the fact that I'd had full bars just minutes before. I sat there for several minutes trying to figure out what to do. I could turn around and go back the way I'd come, but that would mean explaining to the customer why their medical equipment was going to be late, and I wasn't sure how to explain a highway that ended in the middle of nowhere. Finally, I put the truck in reverse and began the complicated process of turning around on a highway that was barely wide enough for my truck and trailer. It took several back-and-forth maneuvers, but I eventually got pointed in the right direction and started driving back toward the toll booth. But when I reached the spot where the toll booth had been, there was nothing there. Just empty highway stretching in both directions, no lights, no structures, no signs that anything had ever existed at that location. The pavement was continuous and unmarked, showing no evidence that it had ever been interrupted by a toll installation. I stopped and got out of my truck, walking around the area with my flashlight, looking for any trace of what I had seen. The pavement was smooth and weathered, marked with the usual cracks and patches you'd expect from years of desert sun and occasional frost. There were no bolt holes where barriers might have been mounted, no electrical connections where lights might have been powered, no foundation marks where a booth might have been constructed. But in my wallet, I found proof that something had happened. My $5 bill was gone, replaced by a $1 bill and change that totaled exactly $1.50. The coins were still cold to the touch, and they had an odd weight to them, as if they were made of some metal I didn't recognize. I got back in my truck and continued west, eventually crossing into New Mexico and completing my delivery to Phoenix on schedule. But the experience haunted me, and I found myself researching the section of highway where it had happened, looking for any explanation that made sense. What I found was even more disturbing than the experience itself. According to historical records, that section of I-10 had been the site of a temporary toll facility back in the 1960s during the original construction of the interstate. The toll had been intended to help fund construction costs, but it had been removed decades before I was even born, long before I started driving truck. And according to accident reports I found in newspaper archives, at least 3 drivers had died at that location over the years, all of them in single-vehicle accidents, all of them apparently driving off the road for no apparent reason. The most recent had been a trucker like me, hauling a load west toward New Mexico, who had somehow driven straight off the highway into the desert, as if he had been following a road that wasn't there. I never drove that section of I-10 at night again, always timing my trips to pass through during daylight hours. But sometimes when I'm driving other highways in other states, I see lights ahead that seem out of place, structures that shouldn't exist, attendants in booths who move with mechanical precision and speak in voices that sound like recordings. And I always pay the toll, whatever it might be, because I've learned that some transactions are more than just exchanges of money. Sometimes you're paying for passage through places that exist in the spaces between what's real and what's possible, and the cost of refusing to pay might be higher than you can afford. The coins from that night are still in my wallet, cold and heavy and somehow wrong. They serve as a reminder that the highways we travel are more complex than they appear on any map, and that some tolls are collected by attendants who may not be entirely human, for journeys that may not lead to destinations that exist in our normal understanding of geography. Story 9. Highway Howlers. Roy Patterson speaking, and I'm going to tell you about something that happens on the desert highways of Texas that most drivers won't talk about, either because they don't believe it themselves or because they're afraid other people won't believe them. I've been running loads through the Southwest for 24 years, and I've heard the highway howlers more times than I care to count. The first time it happened, I was on a run from Denver to Laredo, hauling a load of automotive parts through some of the loneliest country in America. It was early March, still cold at night, but with the promise of spring in the air, and I was making good time on Highway 285 south through New Mexico and into Texas. This is oil country with pump jacks scattered across the landscape like mechanical dinosaurs, and you can go for miles without seeing another human being. I was somewhere south of Carlsbad running through the night because I liked the cooler temperatures and lighter traffic when I first heard them. It started as a distant sound barely audible over the noise of my engine and the wind through my partially open windows. At first I thought it might be coyotes. The desert is full of them, and they're most active at night, hunting in packs across the scrubland. But as I listened more carefully, I realized that what I was hearing wasn't quite right for coyotes. The howls were too deep, too resonant, and they seemed to be coming from multiple directions at once. Sometimes they sounded like they were off to my left, in the direction of the Guadalupe Mountains, and sometimes they seemed to be coming from my right, from the oil fields that stretched toward the Pecos River. The sound grew louder as I continued south, until it was clearly audible even over my radio and engine noise. It was definitely howling, the long, mournful calls that predators make to communicate with their pack members. But there was something almost musical about it, a harmony and rhythm that seemed too complex for wild animals. I'd been driving these routes long enough to know that sound carries strangely in the desert, especially at night. The dry air and flat terrain can make distant noises seem close or carry voices and sounds for miles from their source. So I wasn't immediately worried, just curious about what might be making such an unusual sound. That changed when I realized the howling was following me. At first I thought it was just coincidence. Desert animals are territorial, and it would make sense for different packs to announce their presence as I passed through their hunting grounds. But as I continued driving, the howls seemed to track my movement along the highway, staying at roughly the same distance from my truck no matter how fast I drove or which direction the road turned. I slowed down to see if the sounds would continue past me, but they slowed down too, maintaining their relative position to my truck. I sped up and they sped up as well, the howling keeping pace with my movement like an acoustic escort that I couldn't see but couldn't escape. Around 2 a.m. I pulled into a truck stop outside of Pecos, needing fuel and hoping that getting out of my truck would help me get a better sense of where the sounds were coming from. The station was brightly lit but nearly deserted, just me and one other truck parked near the diesel pumps. The driver of the other truck was standing beside his rig, apparently doing a pre-trip inspection, but he kept looking out into the darkness beyond the station lights with obvious unease. "You hear them too?" he asked as I approached the fuel island. "The howling?" I replied. "Yeah, I've been listening to it for the past hour. Weird sound for coyotes." He shook his head grimly. "Those ain't coyotes, friend. That's something else entirely. I've been driving these routes for 15 years and I hear them maybe 3-4 times a year, always at night, always in the same general area. And they always follow you." "Follow you how?" I asked, though I already suspected I knew the answer. "However fast you drive, however far you go, they pace you. Like they're hunting you, but they never get close enough to see what they actually are. Some drivers say they've heard voices mixed in with the howling, human voices speaking words they can almost understand but not quite. As if summoned by our conversation, the howling started up again, louder and closer than it had been while I was driving. It seemed to be coming from the darkness just beyond the reach of the station's security lights, a chorus of voices that was definitely not entirely animal. There was something disturbingly human about some of the sounds, as if people were mixed in with whatever creatures were making the noise. The other driver quickly finished his inspection and climbed back into his cab. "Best advice I can give you," he said through his open window, "is keep moving and don't stop in the open desert. They seem to be more active when you're stationary." I fueled up as quickly as possible and got back on the road, but the howling resumed as soon as I was away from the truck stop lights. And this time, there was definitely something more than animal sounds in the mix. I could hear what sounded like broken English mixed in with the howls, fragments of words that almost made sense but not quite. "Roy," I heard, or thought I heard. "Roy Patterson." I cranked up my radio trying to drown out the sounds, but they seemed to penetrate everything, coming through my windows and cab walls as if they were being transmitted directly into my head. The howling grew more insistent, more urgent, and the human-sounding words became more frequent. "Pull over, Roy." "Stop the truck, Roy." "Come out and play, Roy." The fact that they seemed to know my name, a name that wasn't painted on my truck or visible to anyone observing from the desert, filled me with a terror that was almost paralyzing. I pressed harder on the accelerator, pushing my truck up to speeds that were probably unsafe for the desert highway. But I had to try to outrun whatever was pacing me in the darkness. The pursuit continued for another hour, the howling and whispered words following me south through Pecos and toward Fort Stockton. Sometimes the sounds would fade, giving me hope that I'd finally outdistanced whatever was making them, but they always returned, often louder and more aggressive than before. It was around 4 a.m. when my CB radio crackled to life with a burst of static, followed by a voice that sounded almost human but somehow wrong, distorted in a way that made my skin crawl. "Roy Patterson," the voice said, coming through my radio speakers with perfect clarity. "Why are you running, Roy? We just want to welcome you to our territory. We just want to show you our pack." I grabbed the CB microphone with a shaking hand. "Who is this?" I demanded. "What do you want?" The response was a sound that was part howl, part laughter, and part something I can't even describe. A noise that no human throat could make, transmitted through my radio with crystalline clarity. Then the radio went dead. Not just quiet, but completely dead. as if every electronic component had suddenly stopped functioning. But the howling outside my truck grew louder, more triumphant, as if whatever was out there was pleased by this demonstration of their ability to interfere with my equipment. I could hear dozens of voices now, maybe hundreds, all howling in harmony, all keeping perfect pace with my truck as I raced through the Texas night. The sun was just starting to lighten the eastern sky when the sounds finally began to fade. As dawn approached, the howling grew fainter and more distant, until it was just a memory carried on the desert wind. By the time full daylight arrived, the desert was silent except for the normal sounds of wind and traffic and the distant hum of oil field equipment. I completed my run to Laredo without further incident, but I never forgot that night. And over the years, I've heard the highway howlers many more times, always at night, always in the same general area of West Texas, always following the same pattern of pursuit and communication that defies everything we think we know about the natural world. Other drivers have told me similar stories, voices that know their names, sounds that follow their trucks, CB radios that pick up transmissions from something that shouldn't be able to access those frequencies. But most drivers don't like to talk about it, afraid that acknowledging the experience will somehow make it more real or more likely to happen again. I've developed my own theory about what's happening out there in the desert. I think there are things that hunt along our highways, predators that have adapted to the modern world in ways we don't understand. They've learned to mimic human voices, to access our communications equipment, to use our own technology against us in their hunt for prey. Whether they're animals that have evolved beyond normal parameters or something else entirely, something that exists in the spaces between the natural and supernatural, I don't know. But I know they're real, and I know they're still out there, howling in the darkness and calling drivers by name, waiting for someone foolish enough to stop and answer their invitation to come out and play. The last time I heard them was just 6 months ago on a run from Amarillo to San Antonio. The pattern was the same. Distant howling that grew closer and more complex, human words mixed in with animal sounds, my name whispered through the CB static. But this time there was something new, something that chilled me to the bone. Mixed in with the howling and the whispered words, I heard the sound of truck engines. Multiple engines running in the distance, pacing me just like the voices. And I realized that maybe some drivers who had heard the highway howlers hadn't been as lucky as I was. Maybe some of them had stopped, had answered the invitation, had joined the pack that hunts along the desert highways of Texas. Now, when I drive those routes at night, I sometimes see lights in my mirrors that might be other trucks, but that never get closer no matter how I adjust my speed. And I wonder if those are the drivers who answered the call, who pulled over when the voices knew their names, who are now part of something that prowls the darkness between the towns, howling at the moon and hunting for the next trucker brave enough, or foolish enough, to drive alone through the vast emptiness of the American Southwest. Story 10. The Pale Convoy, Greg Morrison here, and I'm going to tell you about an encounter I had with what I call the Pale Convoy. 3 white semi-trucks that appeared behind me on a lonely stretch of Highway 90 east of Marfa and followed me for over 100 miles in ways that no normal vehicles should be able to follow anything. This happened about 18 months ago on a run from El Paso to San Antonio, and I still get chills thinking about it. I was hauling a load of industrial equipment, heavy machinery that required careful handling and adherence to specific routes approved for oversized loads. The equipment was bound for a manufacturing plant outside San Antonio, and the customer had paid premium rates for experienced handling and on-time delivery. I'd been driving oversized loads for 12 years, so this was routine work for me, or should have been. It was early October, and I was making good time despite the restrictions that come with hauling oversized freight. The weather was perfect for driving. Clear skies, moderate temperatures, and light traffic that made it easy to maintain safe distances and appropriate speeds. I was feeling good about the run, enjoying the spectacular desert scenery and looking forward to completing another successful delivery. I was about 30 miles east of Marfa, on a section of Highway 90 that runs straight as an arrow through some of the most desolate landscape in Texas, when I first noticed the 3 white trucks in my mirrors. They appeared suddenly as if they had materialized out of the desert heat shimmer, spaced evenly across all 3 lanes of the westbound side of the highway. At first glance, they looked like normal semi-trucks, Peterbilt or Kenworth tractors pulling standard 53-foot trailers. But there were things about them that immediately struck me as odd. They were all identical, painted the same shade of white that was so bright it almost hurt to look at in the desert sun. They had no company logos, no DOT numbers, no identifying markings of any kind, just blank white surfaces that reflected the sunlight like mirrors. More importantly, they were traveling in perfect formation, maintaining exactly the same spacing between them and exactly the same distance behind my truck. In 12 years of driving, I'd never seen anything like it. Most truck convoys are loose affairs, with drivers maintaining radio contact but allowing for normal variations in speed and spacing. These 3 trucks moved as if they were connected by invisible wires responding to changes in my speed and direction with mechanical precision. I tried raising them on my CB radio, cycling through all the standard channels that drivers use to communicate. Breaker 19, this is eastbound oversize on Highway 90. You got 3 white trucks behind me looking for a radio check. Silence. No response. Not even static or background noise. It was as if those trucks didn't exist on the radio frequencies despite being clearly visible in my mirrors. I slowed down from 65 to 60, curious to see how they would respond. All 3 trucks slowed down as well, maintaining their exact spacing and formation. I sped up to 70, and they matched my speed instantly. Their movements so synchronized it was like watching a perfectly choreographed performance. This continued for the next 20 miles through the small town of Alpine and out onto the desert highway beyond. No matter what I did, speeding up, slowing down, changing lanes, the 3 white trucks maintained their formation behind me with mathematical precision. They never tried to pass, never varied their spacing, never showed any of the normal behavior you'd expect from independent drivers. Around noon, I stopped for fuel and lunch at a truck stop outside of Sanderson. I pulled into the facility and parked at the diesel island, expecting the 3 white trucks to either follow me in or continue past on the highway. Instead, they pulled off the highway and parked in a row across the street from the truck stop, their white surfaces gleaming in the afternoon sun. I finished fueling and went inside for lunch, keeping an eye on the white trucks through the restaurant windows. They sat there motionless. No signs of activity, no drivers getting out to fuel or inspect their equipment. Just 3 identical white trucks parked in perfect formation, apparently waiting. I talked to other drivers in the restaurant, asking if anyone had seen the white trucks before or knew who might be operating them. Nobody had any information, but several drivers mentioned that they'd had similar experiences, mysterious convoys that would appear on remote highways and follow them for miles before disappearing as suddenly as they had arrived. "It's like they're herding us," one driver said, "following us to make sure we stay on the route they want us to take." But why they'd want to do that, I couldn't tell you. After lunch, I went back to my truck and prepared to get back on the highway. As soon as I started my engine, the 3 white trucks started theirs as well, the sound of their diesel engines perfectly synchronized. When I pulled out of the truck stop and back onto Highway 90, they fell into formation behind me exactly as they had before. The afternoon passed much like the morning had, with the white trucks maintaining their mysterious escort. But as the sun began to set and shadows lengthened across the desert, their behavior became more aggressive, Instead of following at a respectful distance, they began to close in, positioning themselves just outside my legal following distance in a way that felt increasingly threatening. By the time darkness fell, the three trucks had moved into a triangular formation around my rig, one directly behind me and one on each side, boxing me in so that I couldn't change lanes or vary my speed without risking a collision. Their headlights were blindingly bright, much brighter than standard truck lights, and they reflected off my mirrors in a way that made it difficult to see anything else on the road. I was starting to panic, feeling like a prey animal being herded by predators, when something even stranger happened. The truck directly behind me began flashing its lights in what appeared to be a pattern. Not the random flashing of someone trying to get my attention, but a deliberate sequence that repeated over and over. I counted the flashes. 3 short, 3 long, 3 short. Morse code for SOS. The message repeated several times, then changed to a different pattern. This one was longer, more complex, and it took me several repetitions to figure out what it was saying. Follow us. I had a choice to make. I could continue on my planned route to San Antonio, risking whatever consequences might come from ignoring the white truck's message, or I could follow them and see where they wanted to lead me. Neither option felt safe, but staying boxed in by 3 trucks whose drivers I couldn't see and couldn't communicate with felt like the more dangerous choice. When we reached the next intersection, a small county road that led north into the desert, the truck behind me flashed its lights again. Turn here. Against every instinct I'd developed in 12 years of professional driving, I put on my turn signal and followed the white trucks off the highway onto a narrow 2-lane road that wasn't marked on any of my maps. The road was paved but in poor condition, full of potholes and cracks that made my heavy load bounce and sway uncomfortably. We drove north into increasingly remote country, past abandoned ranch buildings and oil wells that looked like they hadn't been active in decades. The white trucks maintained their formation around me, their bright headlights creating an artificial daylight that made the surrounding desert look like an alien landscape. After about 30 miles of this, we came to what appeared to be the end of the road, a place where the pavement simply stopped and gave way to desert sand and scrub brush. I expected the white trucks to turn around, to lead me back to the highway, but instead they did something that violated every law of physics I thought I understood. They drove straight out into the desert, not on a hidden road or trail, but directly over the sand and rocks and vegetation, their wheels never bogging down, their speed never decreasing. They moved across the desert terrain as if it were paved highway, leaving no tracks behind them, disturbed no vegetation, raised no dust clouds. I stopped my truck at the end of the pavement and watched in amazement as the 3 white trucks drove straight into the desert darkness, their headlights creating moving pools of light that grew smaller and smaller until they finally disappeared entirely. Within minutes they were gone, swallowed by the vast emptiness of the Texas desert as if they had never existed. I sat there for a long time trying to process what I had witnessed. Trucks don't drive across open desert without getting stuck. They don't leave no tracks. They don't disappear into the darkness like ghosts. But I had seen it happen with my own eyes, and I had no explanation that made any sense. Eventually, I managed to turn my truck around on the narrow road and drive back to Highway 90, where I continued on to San Antonio and completed my delivery on schedule. But I never reported what had happened, and I never tried to find that desert road again. Some experiences are too strange to share, too impossible to investigate. But sometimes when I'm driving alone on remote highways at night, I see bright white lights in my mirrors that seem to maintain perfect formation no matter how I vary my speed or direction. And I wonder if the pale convoy is still out there, still following drivers through the desert darkness, still leading them to destinations that don't exist on any map. I've developed a theory that the white trucks are some kind of test, a way for unknown entities to evaluate how drivers respond to the impossible and unexplained. Those who follow them into the desert might discover something about the hidden nature of the highways we travel, or they might simply vanish into the spaces between what's real and what's possible. I chose not to follow them all the way, and I've never regretted that decision. But I sometimes wonder what I would have found if I had been brave enough, or foolish enough, to drive my truck out into that impossible desert, following three white ghosts toward a destination that exists only in the realm of mystery and nightmare. The highways of America are more complex than they appear on any map, and some convoys are escorting drivers not to earthly destinations, but to places where the rules of reality break down and the impossible becomes routine. The wise driver learns to recognize these invitations and politely decline, because some journeys are too strange to survive, and some destinations are too far from home to ever allow a return. Story 11. The Black Trailer. Sam Rodriguez here, and I'm going to tell you about something I saw on Highway 285 north of Fort Stockton that still haunts my dreams 2 years later. It was the kind of sight that makes you question everything you think you know about the world. The kind of experience that changes you in ways you can't fully explain to people who weren't there. I was running a load of construction materials from Austin to Carlsbad, taking the scenic route through some of the most beautiful desert country in America. It was late May and the weather was perfect for driving, warm but not hot, clear skies, and the kind of light that makes the desert landscape look like something from a postcard. I'd been driving professionally for 14 years, mostly hauling loads throughout Texas and the Southwest, and I thought I'd seen everything these highways had to offer. I'd driven past abandoned towns, strange roadside attractions, and all manner of unusual sights that you encounter when you spend your life on the road. But nothing had prepared me for what I would see parked on the shoulder of Highway 285 that Tuesday afternoon. It was about 3 p.m. and I was making good time through the desert north of Fort Stockton. The highway was relatively quiet, just the occasional car or truck sharing the road with me, and I was enjoying the scenery and the peaceful rhythm of long-distance driving. The radio was playing classic country music from a station in Odessa, and my truck was running smoothly, eating up the miles with mechanical precision. That's when I saw it in the distance. A massive black trailer parked on the shoulder of the highway, sitting by itself with no tractor attached. At first I thought it might be a breakdown situation, maybe a driver who'd had to drop his trailer for mechanical reasons and was waiting for a replacement tractor. But as I got closer, I could see that something was definitely wrong with the picture. The trailer was huge, bigger than any standard semi-trailer I'd ever seen. It looked like it might be 60 or even 70 feet long. Painted a black so deep and absolute that it seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. There were no company markings, no DOT numbers, no identifying information of any kind. Just a smooth black surface that looked almost liquid in the desert sun. But the strangest thing was its position. The trailer was parked perfectly parallel to the highway, sitting level on what appeared to be a completely flat section of desert floor. There were no tire tracks leading to it, no disturbed earth around it, no signs that any vehicle had ever approached or departed from that location. It was as if the trailer had been placed there by a giant crane, dropped from the sky into a position that would be impossible for any normal truck to achieve. I slowed down as I approached, my curiosity overcoming my usual practice of minding my own business on the highway. The trailer had no landing gear visible, nothing supporting it except what looked like a series of steel posts that disappeared into the desert floor. There were no lights on it, no reflective tape, none of the safety equipment that would be required for a trailer parked on or near a public highway. As I drew alongside the trailer, I could see that it had doors, standard trailer doors, but painted the same absolute black as the rest of the structure. And as I watched, one of those doors began to creak open. I should have kept driving. Every instinct I'd developed in 14 years of professional driving was telling me to mind my own business, to stay on the highway, to get as far away from that trailer as possible. But curiosity got the better of me, and I pulled over about 100 yards past the trailer, parked on the shoulder, and walked back to investigate. The desert was absolutely quiet except for the distant sound of wind through the scrub brush and the occasional car passing on the highway. The air was warm and still, with the clean, dry smell of desert sage and creosote. But as I approached the black trailer, I noticed another smell. Something stale and artificial, like the air inside a building that had been closed up for a long time. The trailer door had opened about 3 feet, revealing an interior that was darker than the bright desert afternoon should have allowed. I couldn't see much from where I stood, just hints of shapes and shadows that might have been equipment or furniture. But there was definitely something inside. I could sense movement, hear faint sounds. That might have been mechanical or might have been something else entirely. "Hello?" I called out, feeling foolish but thinking that maybe someone inside needed help. "Anybody in there? You folks having trouble?" No response, but the sounds from inside the trailer seemed to get louder, more active. I could hear what sounded like rustling, like people moving around or repositioning themselves. And underneath that, a sound that made my skin crawl. A low humming, like the sound an old television makes when it's turned on but not tuned to any station. I walked closer to the open door, trying to see inside while staying far enough away that I could run if necessary. The interior of the trailer was much larger than it should have been, given its external dimensions. It stretched back much farther than 70 feet, disappearing into darkness that my eyes couldn't penetrate. But what I could see was even more disturbing than the impossible dimensions. The trailer was filled with chairs, rows and rows of chairs, arranged like seating in a movie theater or auditorium. They were old-fashioned chairs, the kind with wooden frames and fabric seats that you might find in a church or community center from the 1950s. And every single chair was occupied. The figures sitting in the chairs were too far away and too deep in shadow for me to see clearly. But they appeared to be people, men, women, children, all sitting perfectly still, all facing toward the front of the trailer where a single television set flickered with static. The TV was an old model, maybe from the 1960s, with a small screen and rabbit ear antennas, and it was showing nothing but snow and electronic interference. But the people in the chairs were watching it with rapt attention, as if it were broadcasting the most fascinating program ever created. None of them moved, none of them spoke, none of them seemed to notice that I was standing at the open door of their impossible theater. They just sat there, row after row of them, staring at the static-filled screen with an intensity that was both mesmerizing and terrifying. I don't know how long I stood there watching this surreal scene and trying to make sense of what I was seeing. It could have been minutes or hours. Time seemed to have no meaning while I was looking into that trailer. The humming sound grew louder, more hypnotic, and I found myself taking a step forward, then another, drawn toward the rows of chairs and the flickering television. That's when one of the figures in the front row turned around and looked at me. It was a woman, middle-aged, wearing a dress that looked like it was from several decades ago. Her face was pale, her eyes were completely black, and when she smiled at me, I could see that her teeth were too sharp, too numerous, arranged in rows like a shark's. She raised one hand and beckoned to me, gesturing toward an empty chair in the back row. I stumbled backward, my heart pounding with terror, and ran back to my truck as fast as my legs would carry me. I didn't look back, didn't stop to investigate further, didn't try to make sense of what I had seen. I just got in my cab, fired up the engine, and got the hell away from that trailer as quickly as possible. When I was about 5 miles down the highway, I finally worked up the courage to check my mirrors. The black trailer was still visible in the distance, sitting on the desert floor where I had found it. But the door was closed now, and there was no sign of the impossible interior I had glimpsed. I drove straight through to Carlsbad, completed my delivery, and tried to put the experience out of my mind. But over the next few days, I found myself researching the area where I had seen the trailer, looking for any explanation that made sense. What I found was a pattern of disappearances dating back decades. People who had vanished while traveling through that section of highway, leaving behind no traces except abandoned vehicles found on the shoulder of the road. The disappearances weren't frequent, maybe one every few years, but they were consistent. Travelers would stop for unknown reasons, leave their cars or trucks parked on the highway, and simply vanish into the desert without a trace. Search parties would find no footprints, no signs of struggle, no indication of where the missing people had gone. But the most disturbing detail I discovered was in a newspaper article from 1987 describing the disappearance of a family of 4 who had been traveling from Austin to Roswell. Their car had been found parked on Highway 285, doors open, engine still running, personal belongings undisturbed. But witnesses who had passed the scene before police arrived reported seeing a large black trailer parked nearby, a trailer that was gone by the time investigators arrived. I never drove that section of Highway 285 again, always finding alternate routes that added time and miles to my trips but kept me away from whatever was waiting in that black trailer. But sometimes on other highways in other states, I see large, dark vehicles parked in impossible locations, and I wonder if they're all part of the same network, the same system designed to collect travelers who are curious enough or unlucky enough to investigate. The black trailer is still out there, I'm sure of it, sitting in the desert waiting for the next person who will be drawn by curiosity to peer inside and see the rows of chairs, the flickering television. The audience of the disappeared who have become permanent viewers of a program that never ends and never begins, just continues forever in the space between channels, in the static that fills the gaps between what's real and what's possible. And sometimes late at night when I'm driving alone through remote areas, I hear that humming sound, faint and distant but unmistakable. It's the sound of old electronics, of televisions tuned to nothing, of an audience waiting patiently for a show that will never come. And I know that somewhere out there, in trailers that exist in the margins of our reality, the disappeared are still watching, still waiting, still saving seats for the next travelers foolish enough to accept their silent invitation to join the permanent audience of the impossible.